Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Okay, a few reminders before we get started. My name is Molly Marin. I'm the webinar coordinator for the New York State RtI Technical Assistance Center. There's a link in the chat box, and if you follow that, you can get to the PowerPoint as well as 3 handouts that Dr. Bash will refer to today. During today's presentation, please use the chat box for any questions or comments that you may have. And at the end of the presentation, we'll post a link to a brief evaluation. If you could take a few minutes to complete that, we do look at that feedback and appreciate your response. We are very pleased to have Dr. George Bash with us today to present our second webinar in our Strand 16 Response to Intervention, a multi-tiered system of supports series. Today's topic is implementing the Common Core Learning Standards within MTSS. Dr. George Bash is a professor and director of the Institute for School Reform at the University of South Florida and director of the Florida Statewide Problem-Solving RtI Project for the Florida Department of Education. And at this time, it is my pleasure to welcome back Dr. George Bash.
Thanks, Molly. And we have a small group today, which we should have some personalized learning. So feel free to use the chat box, and we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. So just the overall goals of the webinar series, I don't know if you were here last time or not, we're really looking at, what are the key components of MTSS? How do we use MTSS to implement the Common Core Learning Standards? How do we integrate problem solving, which is our next topic on the next webinar, into MTSS? How do we align instruction and interventions with the Common Core Learning Standards and integrating instructional practices across the tiers? We're going to start some of that today. Ensuring that we integrate academics and behavior to maximize student engagement. Where do students with disabilities fit into this? Students with 504 accommodations, specially designed instruction. Hopefully have courageous conversations with ourselves, maybe. Reflect, celebrate, reverberate, and breathe a little bit, and get fired up about this. So just by way of review, last time we talked about the similarities and differences between RtI and MTSS. We introduced the 6 components of MTSS, talked a little bit about what it looks like, the different levels of implementation, and some basic principles that are important to MTSS. We have 3 handouts today, 2 of which we're going to use today. One, the 4-step problem-solving process is, if you're going to be joining us on the next webinar, I would like for you to read that ahead of time, if at all possible. So we're not going to be talking about that one today, but we are going to be using the other 2. So today what we're going to talk about is some of the fundamentals of instruction within a multi-tiered system, integrating academics and behavior, how to use academic engaged time and scheduling for more intensive instruction, aligning MTSS with the Common Core Learning Standards, and unpacking the standards in order to focus on instruction, but within an MTSS model. So hopefully that will be of interest to you. So first, how do we look at instruction from the student, the learner perspective? In an MTSS model, we look at what the student is doing in 3 ways. Academic skills, which are, those things we want kids to know, understand, and do. They could also be behavior skills, but they're the CUD, the know, understand, and do, and they're tied to the Common Core Learning Standards. So if we're problem solving a group of 3rd graders or 9th graders who are not achieving what we want them to achieve, we start out with what standards are they at risk for not attaining? Which are the Common Core Learning Standards that are grade or subject area specific, or developmental standards if the kids are really young? Academic behaviors are those behaviors that students have to engage instruction. And the inter and intrapersonal behaviors. Interpersonal are those things, that skills that kids need to get along with each other. And intrapersonal behaviors are those things that are internal to the student. So things like anxiety, how they manage anxiety, how they deal with depression. But one of the intrapersonal behaviors that is so important to student schooling is private speech. With the exception of students with thought disorders or students who act impulsively, private speech is what students say to themselves before they engage in a behavior. So if a teacher puts a paper down or asks them to do it or introduces a task to the class, if the student says something to him or herself like, "This is stupid," they're not going to engage that. If they say at the beginning of a math lesson, "I have no clue what the teacher is talking about," they will disengage. So when we are problem solving with students who are not doing well, who are not engaged, who are struggling, this area of private speech is very important. And more importantly, what can we do as educators in the moment to turn that private speech around to something more positive? So every academic skill has an associated academic behavior. And one of the handouts for today that you might choose to download is this list of academic behaviors. If you're familiar with skill streaming, which is a social skills training program that is published by Research Press, which you could Google, for early childhood, elementary, and middle high school, there's a section in each of these called classroom survival skills. And those classroom survival skills are the things that students need to know how to do in order to engage instruction. So something as simple as following directions, verbal participation. Really an important one is asking a question. It is the engagement skill that students lack the most. And where that has instructional implications is a teacher gauges his or her instructional content and strategies around what he or she thinks students know and do not know. And when students ask legitimate questions, that's a way to communicate with the teacher around what they don't know. The teacher then calibrates their instruction to respond to those questions, but also you keep in the back of your head, if 2 or 3 students ask questions about the same stuff, they're not getting it, and you're going to have to reteach it. Well, that skill of asking a question is really poorly developed in our kids today. Things like self-control to ignore distractions, monitoring your own behavior, accepting correction. Those are all skills that have to be pretty well developed for a student to be engageable in that instructional process. If we fail to consider academic behaviors when we're developing instruction, this will result in students lacking the skills to engage the instruction. Teachers shouldn't have the burden of teaching and also ensuring that at every moment they're having to drag students into engagement. It will also result in instruction that can actually facilitate student engagement in ways that are disruptive. So as a teacher, as you look at your Common Core learning standards and in your lesson planning process, develop instructional routines for that particular standard. If those instructional routines require engagement skills that students don't have, then as you begin those instructional routines, the students are going to become disengaged. So if you have students in groups, center-based instruction, and that's an important part of your lesson, but you don't have students whose engagement skills are appropriate for a group, they don't know how to take a turn, they don't know how to monitor their own behavior, they don't know how to participate in a group, then the teacher is going to start those instructional routines and immediately have to manage student behavior because the instruction and the student engagement skills were poorly matched. So when that happens, or if a teacher anticipates it, we can either change the instructional strategy to match the student engagement behaviors that they already have, or we can teach the student engagement behaviors as part of the instruction. We'll talk more about that in a moment. It could also result in the lack of student achievement because they lack the skills necessary to participate in and practice the academic skills. And it also could result in the potential labeling of a student as unmotivated or disinterested, not because they are, but because they lack the skills that would be interpreted as motivated or interested. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. So designing instruction in the context of what student skills, of what the skills the students will need to engage the instruction is important. Designing instruction that aligns with engagement skills that the kids already have, and directly teaching engagement skills. So you may be familiar with Anita Archer, who is kind of the earth mother of explicit instruction. And in her publications and webinars, she demonstrates how to teach participation routines to students. There's a great video of her teaching participation routines to middle school kids who really have never learned how to verbally participate, how to raise their hand in one way to communicate one thing, raise their hand in another way to communicate another kind of participation. So to simplify and bottom line this is in the lesson planning process, once we identify the standard that we are going to focus on and we identify what those learning progressions are, we then develop instructional routines for the classroom. But within an MTSS model to integrate academics and behavior, we simultaneously ask ourselves, what engagement skills are necessary for this routine? And if students don't have them, we either modify the routine or we teach the skills. So integrating academics, behavior, and universal design is part of MTSS. So if we take this model of where a teacher presents a student with grade level task and the student engages in a problem behavior, we know that the vast majority of elementary school children and middle school children will engage in problem behavior to avoid doing a task, particularly if when they do that, they can escape the task, they get sent to the office or something like that. The teacher then removes the task or removes the student. The student escapes the task, and the student's academic skills don't improve, and the next time the teacher presents the task, the whole cycle begins again. So do academic problems lead to behavior problems, or behavior problems lead to academic problems? I had one of my doctoral students who asked that question specifically and investigated at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. When students had both academics and behavior problems, which do we hit first? If we can't hit both of them, which one will have the best effect on the other? And what she found was for elementary, attacking the academic problem first significantly reduced the behavior problem. Now, of course, it's ideal to do both, but engaging students in the academics reduces the behavior problem. You know, it's physics, right? There's 350 minutes of a day in school. If we can engage kids, for every minute we can engage kids more fully, that is 1 minute less that they're going to be able to act out. So by increasing student engagement in the academics will naturally lead to a reduction in the behaviors, particularly those for students who are escaping something they don't think they can do. At the middle school level, there was still a benefit to attacking the behavior problems first. Not as strong as elementary, but certainly in the direction of attacking behavior problems first. At the high school, there was no difference. So ideally, we do both. But if you have to lead with one, lead with academic solutions for elementary and middle school, and you will get a benefit in the reduction in the behavioral issues. I've given you some research, if you're interested in following up with it, that shows how if you address academic and behavioral strategies together, that student achievement will be significantly better than if you only attack typically one of them. So if you take a look at that second statement, there are 3 or 4 research studies that show that high quality academic instruction, content matched to student success level, frequent opportunity to respond, frequent feedback, in other words, students are engaged, by itself can reduce behavior problems. And that was the point that I was making a few minutes ago. The reverse is also true. What we have not found as much is simply improving student behavior for students with serious learning issues by itself is not sufficient, because now that the student is more fully engaged, we still need some specialized instruction to focus on those learning issues. One of the things that Don Hernandez demonstrated a few years ago through a longitudinal study funded by the Annie E. Casey Foundation was an answer to this question. For students who are struggling with reading and who live in poverty, what strategy is the best for ensuring that these students graduate on time? And what he found out was that if we have students who are reading at grade level at the end of 3rd grade, even though they live in significant poverty, that their chances of graduation are much higher. And so therefore, teaching reading to poor kids, we can't do much about the poverty, but if we can get them to read successfully, we truly have made a significant difference in their on-time graduation rate and their post-secondary outcomes. So I'll make a point in a few minutes when we come to the standards, but the idea that early elementary risk factors don't relate to graduation issues is false, both academically as well as behaviorally. So back to that slide. In essence, having kids who come from impoverished backgrounds, having them able to read at the end of 3rd grade, to some degree mitigates the effects of poverty. And as educators, we know how to teach kids how to read. We may not be great at eliminating poverty. We talked a little bit last time, but I want to mention it again, that academic engaged time, the amount of time per day and week that students engage in quality instruction, is the best predictor of student growth and student performance. So how we use our time in a multi-tiered system becomes critical. We're going to talk more about this when we get to schedules in a few minutes. But just think about this logically. If the use of time is important to student growth and achievement, and schedules determine time, then MTSS is greatly influenced by the schedule that the school has. And we'll see that in a moment. So how do we manage instructional time as it relates to student growth? So if we have 90 minutes a day for English language arts area, that's 450 minutes a week. If we have 50 minutes a day for algebra, that's 250 minutes a week if the high school doesn't have a block schedule. So what is the level of gap for students who are behind? How much additional time of quality instruction is needed? What the research has shown us and what informs time in MTSS is up to 50% or more in the next tier. So if we have 90 minutes a day for English language arts and 50 minutes a day for algebra, for kids who are struggling, then up to 50% more time. That would be 135 minutes a day for English language arts and 75 minutes a day for algebra for tier 2, and up to 180 minutes a day for English language arts for tier 3, and 100 minutes a day for algebra. So if a student in the 4th grade is a year behind in reading, let's say, that student needs at least tier 2. They need 135 minutes a day. If they are 2 years behind in 4th grade, they're going to need tier 3, 180 minutes a day. And without that, they may be able to improve, but not close the gap. And when we start talking about the tiers, we'll get into instructionally what that looks like. So the question is, how do we do this? So you have on your screen now an example of a 4th grade schedule. This is one from schools that I work with. And I want you to look carefully at it for a couple of things. Excuse me. I want you to, if you count the number of transitions on the left-hand side, you will find that there are 11 transitions for 4th graders each day. You will also notice, looking across the top, that the schedule is different for Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, and than it is for Wednesday. So if you happen to have a pen or a pencil in front of you, a couple of things I want you to write down here in a moment. If we have 11 transitions, the average amount of time that it takes for a student to re-engage an activity at the same level as they were engaged in with the previous activity in the elementary school is about 8 minutes. That's assuming we don't it's not moving rooms. If we move from one room to another, it takes, or to PE or recess or what have you, it takes even longer. But let's take the 8 minutes. We have 11 transitions here. 11 times 8 is 88. So 88, let's just say 90, of 350 minutes a day, that's a quarter of the day just in transition. If academic engaged time is the best predictor of student growth, we just gave away 90 minutes. Now, that may be okay for students who are at or above grade level, subject area, but for students who struggle, English language learners, students with disabilities, it's not okay. And we have to find a way to recoup those minutes. Some ways that schools do that is, particularly at the elementary level, they will organize instruction using thematic instruction. So they integrate reading, science, and math, a unit on dinosaurs. You read about dinosaurs, you do the science of dinosaurs, and you do math associated with dinosaurs. That way you're not engaging in the transitions. There are other ways to do that, sequencing, reading, followed by subject areas that reading is important in, as opposed to switching necessarily from reading to math to PE, where there isn't a natural connection. So now look down the second column from the left. You'll see reading takes place between 8:45 and 10:15. That's 90 minutes. That's typical in elementary schools. So write down 90 on your paper. You will see that there's another one called reading enrichment. To be honest with you, I don't know what that is, but I think it's a waste of time because I don't know if it takes 10 minutes for transition, how 10 minutes of reading enrichment can be meaningful at all. That may be a break for kids and teachers. I would eliminate that. If you keep going down, you'll see specials. One of the things many of our elementary schools doing are blocking schedules so that a grade level team, all the kids at a grade level go to the specials. And that way the team can use that time for planning, MTSS work, data, analysis, etc. The next thing is science, then lunch. And now we see reading intervention again. That's 12:30 to 1. That's 30 minutes. So write down another 30 minutes. And then math, and then language arts or language arts ESOL. That's 60 minutes. So 90, 30, and 60. If you add that up, you will see that there's 180 minutes a day built in to literacy. Now that 2 to 3 o'clock, that could also be used for other things, for other students who don't need additional instruction, or it can be used for enrichment or something similar to that. So we have built in a total of 180 minutes. Look down that column by subject. What's missing? Somebody put in the chat box, what do you see that's missing from the subject areas? Anybody? Feel like Ferris Bueller's Day Off here. Anybody? I see some. Absolutely. Thank you. Social studies. In this schedule, we integrate social studies into English language arts. So we can get that extra 60 minutes. So if you happen to be working in a school where your students are not doing what you want them to do in literacy, or literacy is a big area, this is one way, this is an example of a schedule that enables you to have a multi-tiered system of supports, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, built into your daily schedule. The other thing I want to point out about the schedule is that this schedule is a 4th grade schedule. And in our MTSS schools, once we find a schedule that meets the needs of the kids in that grade level, that schedule follows the kids. So the 4th grade schedule becomes the 5th grade schedule. In addition, all of the special area teachers, plus reading support, special ed, counselors, etc., they already have their time allocated for this group of students. So as the schedule shifts with the students, it makes the adult scheduling a lot easier. Clearly, the only schedule that this doesn't work for is kindergarten, because we don't know the needs of those kids yet. And of course, we would modify the schedule as necessary as the needs of kids change. So a takeaway here, a couple of takeaways. We want to build in 180 minutes for literacy because it's that foundational skill. Daniel Hernandez's work shows us that literacy in 3rd grade is the best predictor of on-time graduation. We can integrate social studies, which is a very literacy-rich subject area, and we can get 180 minutes. Also, schedules follow groups of kids. So I'm going to move now to an example at the high school. And this is an example in a school we're working with, and we implemented this in December of this last year. This school has 3 levels of algebra. Each teacher teaches 1 class of advanced, 2 sections of general, and 1 section for low-performing students. students attend one section only. So you're either in the advanced, general, or low. You could move in between them, but you're assigned to one. So the building principal sat down and looked at the schedule. Because we were working with them around academic engaged time, our first intervention, if you will, or instructional modification for struggling students is to give them more time with traditional instruction, whatever's been going on, to simply give them more time in that instructional area. So we have to find the time. You saw how we found it in the elementary schedule. So the building principal modified the schedule so that each of the low performing sections could get 7 periods a week instead of 5. Those kids got 2 more sections, 2 more times a week. That's a 40% increase. So the kids went from 250 minutes a week to 350 minutes a week for the low performing group. It was the same teachers, no additional staff. I'll talk a little bit about what the teachers did somewhat differently. At the end of this last school year, in May, the students in the low performing group averaged 8% higher scores for the semester than the students in the general sections. 88% of the low performing students received a grade of C or higher, but all of them passed algebra. And they were all at risk for not passing it before. So what was the main strategy in this scenario? One of the most powerful instructional strategies for students who are struggling that don't have significant disabilities, and even with these students it helps, is pre-teach, review, and reteach. So those 7 periods a day, the period prior to the next one was a pre-teaching period. And every cycle of the pre-teach, review, reteach occurred within those 7 periods every week. So students had advanced organizers, they then had the lessons of the day, and then they had some reteaching. The reteaching became the pre-teaching for the next level. So the instructional strategy of 2 things. 1, add more time. 2nd, do heavy doses of pre-teach, review, reteach. With a simple schedule modification, no additional staff, no specialized instruction, made huge differences in these students in those low performing sections. In May, we had focus groups with the teachers, and we said, what'd you do differently? And they said nothing, other than the pre-teach, review, reteach. And they pretty much did that anyway. They said, and I quote one of them, there's nothing wrong with these kids. They don't have a learning disability or a learning problem. They needed more time. They needed more time to practice. They needed more corrective feedback. They needed more routines. And with the extra 100 minutes a week, we were able to do that. So sometimes strategies to improve instruction with kids are not all that complicated. Changing a schedule was probably the most complicated part of this. But within that multi-tiered system of supports, the first approach we take is altering time. And in this case, you see the benefits of doing that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about briefly again, because it's so fundamental to MTSS, is the importance of using rate of growth instead of discrepancy from grade level, for a couple of reasons. The rate of growth is the best measure of the effectiveness of instruction, and it's the most fair measure. So it's how much improvement does a kid make over time. It's really important as well, because if you run out of time or you get short on time, the rate that you have to improve at in the time that's left becomes completely unrealistic. That's why early warning systems are so important, because they identify kids early to give you more time. The more time you have, the less progress a kid has to make in that time. The less time you have, the steeper the progress. So I want to look again at these graphs. These are assessments embedded in the Discovery Math curriculum. And the blue line is the student, the red line is the class that Mackenzie, the student, is in, and the green line are all the students in this grade level. This school has 5 teachers at each grade level. So it has about 100 kids at each grade level. So you can guess the size of the elementary school. So if you look at the slope of the line, how steep it is, look at the blue line, the red line, and the green line. If the steepness of the line is an indicator of the effectiveness of instruction, for whom is the instruction most effective? Mackenzie, the class, or the grade average? And type in the answer that you think by looking at those slopes of the line. Absolutely, Mackenzie. Who's farthest behind? Mackenzie. So it's kind of weird to say this, but the instruction is being most effective for the kid who's the farthest behind. And that's sometimes why we terminate instruction, even though it's working, because we see that that student is so far behind. So if you extended the line from the first 2 data points, you would see that Mackenzie, by the end of the year, had that rate of growth continued, she would probably come pretty close to the other students. So once we have a student or a group of students, their line being steeper than the other lines, it will intercept it at some point. And that's important to know. In this case, we needed to stay the course. Now, an aside that I want to mention here is that if you look at the line between the second and the third data point, you will see that Mackenzie's line tends to flatten. If we were only taking data with Mackenzie, we would think that the instruction became less effective for Mackenzie. But if we look at the other students in her class and at the grade level, we see that everybody's rate of instruction tended to flatten. So we wouldn't rush to change something for Mackenzie. We'd have to figure out what it was that changed for all the students. So that's why we always take data on the students we're concerned about, as well as all the other peers in a class. And if you look at Mackenzie's slope of her line, you'll actually see she's doing better than the other kids in our class, and about the same as the whole grade average. So that looking at the slope of the line, how steep it is our best measure of effectiveness. And we don't want to terminate effective instruction just because a kid is behind. Let's talk for a moment about universal design for learning. This is really an important instructional practice. It is a tier 1 practice, and it focuses on flexibility in the ways information is presented, flexibility in how students can communicate what they know, and the ways in which students are engaged. So it reduces barriers to instruction, provides appropriate accommodations and supports, and you can read, read the rest of it. There are three principles to universal design, and I want you to think about this. If you are a teacher, I want you to think about this in terms of planning your lesson. So if you have students whose fluency is very poor, and you're going to have a lesson where all the students have to first read a paragraph. Let's say it's a paragraph that you figure will take them 5 minutes. And that's the start of your instructional routine. Your students with fluency problems cannot engage that. Let's say you have 6th graders reading at the 2nd grade level for fluency. So you may have some kids, most of the kids, read it from a book or something you give them. Or you may decide to read it to the entire class. Or you may decide to give some kids you reading it on a video. Or you may decide to have technology that converts text to speech. And as an aside here very quickly, I will tell you that here in New York, one of the people involved with the RtI Technical Assistance Center was doing some work with a school that had many, many English language learners. And these kids could not read fluently in English yet. And it was a barrier to them accessing content, particularly in science, social studies, literature. So this individual organized an effort with parents in the community that the school served to do YouTube videos reading in Spanish what the passages said in English. So kids who couldn't read English could go to a YouTube channel, and there was a parent reading that English passage to them in Spanish so that they could gain the content at that point. So that's another way. So how many different ways can you present or represent the instruction to be sure that all kids have equal access to the content? The second principle is, what are all the different ways that you can have kids express or engage in actions to let you know what they've learned? So one of those for reading comprehension could be you'll write a paragraph paraphrasing what you read. Well, that's great for kids whose spelling and stuff is at grade level, but if kids can't read, they can't spell, and if they can't spell, they can't write. So what about a verbal response, a verbal summary? What about using technology, particularly if they're older kids, to do cartoon representations and present a movie? What about for younger kids drawing a picture that contains the key details of the paragraph? So universal design is saying if we only represent the what one way, and if we only allow kids to demonstrate what they know one way, that is going to result in significant numbers of kids not being successful in Tier 1, disengaging, and having to have all sorts of other resources that could be built into Tier 1 to increase the probability of success. We're going to use this, by the way, in a moment for our Unpacking the Standards. So when we look at standards-based instruction and how that fits into MTSS, clearly we have a standard or benchmark aligned to a course description, progression levels, learning goals that lead to learning goals. We then use that standard and learning goals to create an engaging lesson. The learning goals tell us what students should be able to know, understand, and do. The CUD, K-U-D, right? The engaging lesson as we're planning it, we want to go back to the 3 principles of universal design and say, as we're planning an engaging lesson, are we going to have multiple means of representation? Are we going to have multiple means of action and expression? And with the 2 of those, is there going to be multiple ways that students can engage this lesson? And then we will, of course, develop formative, interim, summative, curriculum embedded assessments to see how students do. So let's take a look at standards, such as the Common Core Learning Standards. I want you to look at the kindergarten one on the far left. This is a reading comprehension for literature standard. You'll see with prompting and support, retell familiar stories, including key details. Let's look at the 3rd grade standard. Recount stories, including fables, folktales, and myths. Determine the central message, lesson, or moral, and explain how it's conveyed through key details. The same words in the 3rd grade standard appear in the kindergarten standard. What is different is this central message or moral and how it is conveyed through the key details. So you'll see that the rigor increases across time. Now, if we go to the 6th grade standard, if we look at the 5th grade standard, the 4th grade standard, the 3rd grade standard, we see conveyed through details. Details in the text, particular details. That changes a little bit to objective summary, which is details-based. So what's important, and when I was in the position of a building principal, it was important for me to have discussions with the kindergarten teachers that what they are teaching kids in kindergarten around comprehension, key details, is the same skill necessary in 12th grade. Every grade level plays a part in these standards. And if a grade level doesn't do their part, it puts the next grade level at risk. So we tell our kindergarten teachers, you are teaching the first skill that 12th graders need to graduate. And I think that's important for engaging and understanding the importance of every grade level. Now, I want you to go back to the kindergarten once again. With prompting and support, retell familiar stories, including key details. So the key word here, a couple of them, prompting and familiar. We are trying to teach kids in kindergarten how to discern key details. We're making that easier by using familiar stories and scaffolding with prompting. So it's important, if we're in a school that has diverse learners, to ensure that we're not reading new stories to these kids and trying to assess comprehension. These are familiar stories. So we have to be sure that when we're working on comprehension, either the kids are familiar with the stories from school, or they are familiar with the stories from home or their cultural background. In other words, we have to teach the familiar stories before we start expecting kids to pull key details. Otherwise, background knowledge or lack of it is going to be the limiting factor. So in a multi-tiered system of supports, if we go back to this slide, the learning goal is the focus of what we want kids to know, understand, and do. And in our next webinar, we're going to bring this into the problem-solving process. So I'm going to move forward here a little bit on the slides, so bear with me. I forgot that I put these ones in here with all of the emphasis on it, but that's okay. So if you, let me see here. I want you to, you have a handout on unpacking the standards. So if you could pull that up, download it if you already haven't. Let's look at standards-based instruction and see how this all relates to integrating academics and behavior and that type of thing. So here's the standard that we've been talking about. Third grade standard: recount stories including fables, folktales, etc. Determine the central message and explain how it is conveyed through key details. So you probably already know this, but when we unpack standards, we separate the nouns and the verbs. Literally, we will circle the verbs or the nouns and underline the nouns or the verbs, whichever we're circling and underlining. The verbs are what we expect kids to do. The nouns reflect what we expect kids to know. So as we're doing lesson planning around the standards, and if you look at, I may jump back and forth here. We had a video for you that explained what I just explained, but it's a YouTube video, and we couldn't get it to embed, so we're just skipping it. You can go to that YouTube URL and see it on your own. So how do we move from standards to skills? And then how do we integrate the skills with the behavior? So we have the standard, academic skills needed to access the standard. So if we will go back, I tell you what, let me see here, hold on. Somehow or other I lost my handout. Bear with me for 1 second, please. 1 second. Okay, I found it. Sorry about that. I'm going to jump ahead here to the handout that hopefully you have downloaded. And this should look like the handout you have downloaded. You will see that the standard is at the top. The next thing we do is we write down what we want students to know and what they have to do. So if you look at your slide, or they were color-coded, we want kids to be able to, the do part of it is recount, determine, and convey. They have to know what fables, folktales, and myths are. What they have to know is also what key details are. But remember, they should have been working on this since kindergarten. So the key details represent prior learning. So if we want kids to recount, what are skills that the kids have to have in order to recount something? Well, those skills could be everything from, they have to be able to read words in a written paragraph. So it would be their fluency skills. If they're listening to a YouTube, a book on tape, or text-to-speech, they have to have listening comprehension skills. If they are going to recount, they have to have either writing a passage, or they have to be able to verbally articulate what it is that they heard or read. So we take those verbs and we take the nouns and we say, what are the skills that they have to do that? Now, for kids who are struggling, Once we say this, we will begin to focus on what those kids need instruction with. So let's say I'm going to go back to a 6th grade student reading at the 2nd grade level who has listening comprehension at the 6th grade level. What this kid needs to be able to recount is first read that passage. Well, the kid can't. Now, maybe a reading teacher is working on that. Maybe the kid is getting services for a learning disability and the SLD teacher is working on that. But that kid can't do that skill. So that is going to tell us that we have to have a different way of representing this instruction so that the kid can access the content. And we'll identify the skills that a kid may need Tier 2 or Tier 3 services or specially designed instruction to do. So the first thing we do is to say, which skills do our kids have? Which skills don't they have and we need to focus on? And then prioritize those skills. Now at the bottom of this sheet, you see the first thing is, how do we use universal design to neutralize the skill the kid doesn't have in order to ensure equity and access to the content? So we might use text-to-speech, or the passage is read to the kid. And if the kid can't write, then we're going to allow the kid to dictate answers to questions. Or we're going to be able to give the kid the opportunity to draw pictures to show what it was that they learned. So what universal design strategies are we going to need to have in our classroom in order to neutralize those skill deficits until the skills improve? If we simply started with the standard and said we're going to give kids a 5-minute paragraph, we're then going to give them a worksheet that is going to have 2 parts on it. 1, write a quick summary of what you read, and number 2, answer questions about key details, or even put them in a center and ask that to happen. We would lose a significant number of the kids in our class because they didn't have the academic skills or the engagement skills to do it. But if, as we planned this lesson, we kept the 3 universal design principles in mind, how are we going to have multiple ways of representation, multiple ways of student action and performance? And will that be sufficient to engage students? Then this lesson will become much more engaging. And even though students may not be able to read the words, they will be able to access the content. So with kind of that jumping around, let's take a look at how all this relates to the problem-solving process. We use the problem-solving process when we need to develop instruction and interventions to help kids that are not immediately known to us. So we have 4 steps in the problem-solving process, and we're going to focus on this intensely next time, literally how to do it, what data to collect, etc. But the problem-solving process for me is simply 4 questions. What do we want students to know, understand, and do? Why can't they do it? What are we going to do about it? And did it work? So if we go back to that learning goals section of Common Core Learning Standards, that learning goal goes in step 1. It is the goal for the academics that we're identifying. So the problem-solving process is driven by the learning goals that come from the Common Core Learning Standards. What we don't want to do with the problem-solving process is to focus on what's wrong with the kid. The kid can't read, the kid can't do this. We should have that first step aligned for academics, aligned with the Common Core learning standard that the kid is at risk for not attaining. And we'll do a lot more with that next time. So some of the important knowings, I went ahead and verbalized them. The standards don't indicate how students are to demonstrate the attainment. Recount stories determine. We kind of went through this example. And we went through both of those examples. So I'm going to stop here for today and just summarize quickly that we, at the beginning of our time, we really said there are three different behaviors that we look at in kids in a multi-tiered system. The academic or the behavior skills, the engagement behaviors, and then those inter and intrapersonal behaviors, including private speech. And as we plan lessons, we want to align with the standard, but as we move from goals to an engaging lesson, we want to ask what skills are needed in this learning goal, which skills do the kids have, which do they not have, both engagement and academic. How can we use universal design to neutralize or limit the impact of the skills they don't have? And in particular, with the student engagement skills, we have to ask, are we going to modify our instructional strategies to align with skills the kids do have, or as part of the instruction, are we going to teach the kids the engagement skills? And we're going to talk some more about that the next time that we're together. So we've been at this for about an hour. What questions or comments do you have that I could try to address in the time that we have left? This is kind of a time for you to use the chat box to ask questions or make comments. That's a really good question. How might I get teachers who are resistant to this to see the benefit? So I'm going to give you an answer that the first part is not going to be as easy as the second part. In my years in education, it's my belief that most people resist because they're afraid of losing something if they change what they're doing. So in general, when people don't want to do something, I ask myself, what are they afraid of losing? Are they afraid of losing how they've done something always in the past, and they're losing their confidence? They're afraid to risk. They're afraid that if they risk and it doesn't work, that could be negative. What are they afraid of losing? And that's kind of a generic answer. Now a specific answer. When I want to try something new in a school or different and grow it, I find a teacher who is willing, and maybe a teacher I have a relationship with, who's willing to try. And we go ahead and do it. So let's take this 6th grade kid reading at the 2nd grade fluency level. We use text-to-speech, speech-to-text. We remove the barriers to accessing the content. And we find out that when we use multiple ways of representation and multiple ways of action, that in fact the kid can demonstrate grade-specific comprehension. And we do that, and we have the student data. We may even video a kid doing it. We may, whatever you want to, any ways to document what we did. And then at a staff meeting, we present this case study. And if it is even remotely possible, have the student there as part of it to talk about how it increased the student engagement, how the student felt about that, as well as presenting the student data. So rather than getting large groups of people who might be resistant, I find somebody who's willing to play with me, and we do it together. By doing it together, it reduces the fear factor. We're in it together, and then we present a case study at a faculty meeting. So that's a strategy that I've used forever. It's better than just presenting data. For example, the high school principal and the scheduling thing I showed you. The high school principal, I talked with him last weekend, and he said that he still had 2 people in their high school math department who were not necessarily sold on MTSS. But when he showed them the end of the semester data on these kids in algebra, their response was, okay, we get it. So using data or using a case study and simply showing what can be done, I think is a successful strategy that I could share with you. I'm sure there are others, but this one has been kind of tried and true for me. Other questions? Comments? Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate the nice comment about the presentation. Thank you. And if you are going to join next week, if you can read that problem-solving thing first, and then we're actually going to do case studies with it, as opposed to just talking about what it is. Whoops. Oh, I see you. That's you, Molly. So thank you very much, and you guys have a wonderful week.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bash, for another wonderful presentation. We look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. And the evaluation link is in the chat for those who, in attendance. If you could take a few minutes, I'd appreciate that. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Okay. Take care.